Hello, I'm Anawoltos, and today I would like to explain my presidential tier chart. You may have seen it come out a little bit over a week ago on my podcast with Murda Fassi, but today I'm going to explain to you my reasoning behind this. Now, the first thing that's very important here is that these things are not randomly placed here. These aren't Although these are by personal preference of myself, there are criteria that I gave myself to rate these presidents upon that led to the outcome. So let me just give a little bit of a zoom out so you can see that it is indeed a bit of a bell curve, although, I'd say that's a bell curve. And so the other piece of information that's relevant to this is this. This here is my actual tier list where I put the scores of the presidents. And the scores were decided based on a double 4-point score, which means that from 0 to 8, there are 9 possible permutations of score. And the scores are decided on a 4-point score on domestic policy and a 4-point score on foreign or strategic policy. I decided to sort of mix that up a little bit because in some cases it may not necessarily be foreign, but it may have to do with strategic interests, with a total from 0 to 8, as I mentioned previously. Now, the tier chart itself has ratings similar to very common ones with A, B, C, D, and F, as are the common letter grades that individuals may receive in very many schools. But instead of going with S tiers, I went with AA, AAA, double F, triple F, just to mix things up, and also because I'm a bit tired of seeing S tier. It just does not seem logical to me to use the letter S. Although I know why people use it, I just, on a personal note, do not prefer it. So the actual order in which the presidents are lined up on each row is in historical order. So the earliest presidents will be on the left, while the most recent ones will be on the right. However, they may be in different positions depending on the grade that they receive. So what I'm saying is they're not ordered based on score, because the score doesn't allow me to order them because it's not detailed enough. So the first one, George Washington, gets a, let me just zoom in here, a AAA rating. And you may ask, how so? Why does George Washington receive a AAA rating? Well, he's got a 4 in domestic policy and a 4 in foreign policy, and remember, what I'm saying when it returns to foreign policy and domestic policy is not necessarily how good they are overall, although that does factor in somewhat. It has a bit more to do with how they strengthen or weaken the position of the country in the long term. And I do have to say that George Washington, being the first president arriving since the U.S. Constitution was enacted in, I think it's 1789 is the year in which it's fully enacted. And of course, the United States was moving off of the Articles of Confederation, which were signed into law in 1777, and therefore it was up to George Washington to really ensure that all the elements of the Constitution were fully enacted and fully enforced, and also to ensure that the foreign and domestic policy of the new order of the country would function. And I would have to say that, in my opinion, he succeeded both in terms of foreign policy, achieving many great things, but also with domestic policy as well. It is also worth noting that John Quincy Adams began his diplomatic career during the Washington administration. But of course, he would become president eventually as well. So our second president on the list is over here. This is James Madison. Let me just double check on my scores. Not James Madison. What I'm saying, John Adams. I'm really sorry. Uh, this is James Madison. This is John Adams. For some reason, my mind just went inside out. I apologize. I was talking about the Constitution, and James Madison was really important in helping to write the Constitution. But no, we're talking about John Adams. Now, generally speaking, John Adams, he was the first and only president to be part of the Federalist Party. And generally speaking, his economic policies as well as his foreign policy ended up being less than George Washington's, so I gave him a double demerit. By the way the 4-point score system works: 0 if you really messed up, 1 if it's less good, 2 if it's business as usual, 3 if you're doing really well, and 4 if you're doing superbly well. So I gave him a 1 and a 1 on both foreign and domestic policy, because he just overall did not make the same. His achievements are not comparable to his predecessor, is what I'm trying to say. There's also issues relating to the Alien and Seditions Act and big controversies, and ultimately it's no surprise that the Federalist Party did not get reelected, and he was then succeeded by the Republican Party, which in more recent years have been historically referred to as the Democratic Republican Party, as that party eventually became the foundation of what is today's Democratic Party. But anyway, next president, Thomas Jefferson, going up on the list, gets a double A. And why does he get a double A? Because I think he generally improved on the foreign policy of John Adams. Therefore, he gets domestic policy. My mind's backwards. He improved on the domestic policy of John Adams, and therefore gets a 3. And he also made the Louisiana Purchase, which for strategic interests, such a large purchase counts as a 4, which gives him a total of a 7 and a double A rating. Next president, James Madison. We've actually gone to the Madison man. Unfortunately, James Madison did have some issues, although his domestic policy was really business as usual. His foreign policy did get into the War of 1812, which many individuals, even in those days, considered to be an unnecessary war. They called it Mr. Madison's War, so it's really a foreign policy faux pas, as you would say. Now, the next one, James Monroe, moving back up to the A rating. James Monroe, he initiated the Monroe Doctrine, which had significant strategic influences on the rest of the American continent, or continents, depending on how you divide them, and would really be a long-term staple of U.S. foreign policy. However, domestically speaking, it was also business as usual. However, it is worth saying that he was the only president, or at least he was the president to get the closest to unanimous election, as opposed to George Washington, who actually got unanimously elected. There's also under James Monroe's administration that the Federalist Party fully fell apart, and the new party system after that arose from factionalism within the what at the time was called the Republican Party. So, next on the list, we have John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams was the Secretary of State under James Madison, and as I've mentioned earlier, he's been generally an important foreign policy, an individual in foreign policy, an important diplomat for the United States for quite some time, from the time of George Washington until the time of his own election. And ultimately, he is generally considered to be responsible for James Monroe's foreign policy achievements. Therefore, I give him a 3 in foreign policy, because although he generally did well in foreign policy, by the time of his own presidency, there wasn't really much left for him to achieve in foreign policy, and a 2 in domestic policy. So he gets a B rating, still above average there. Andrew Jackson. So let me not zoom in too much. Andrew Jackson down here gets an F rating. You may wonder why F rating. Well, on foreign policy, he was strong as usual. He also ended up having some significant problems that ultimately would lead to some long-term issues, as well as some humanitarian crises during his presidency, particularly when it concerns his strong opinion relating to Indian removal, and what at the time many people criticized Andrew Jackson for treating the office of the presidency in an almost dictatorial way. And because of that, he gets 0 in domestic policy, also relating to his issues with economic policy as well. But ultimately, Andrew Jackson, I do not approve. Therefore, next one, Martin Van Buren, who, by the way, is, as far as I know, unless I don't know about Donald Trump, the only president who is not related to any other president in any way when it concerns marriages and births and descent and anything. He has a different heritage than the rest. But anyway, that's besides the point. He was the right-hand man of Andrew Jackson. Oh, and he also notably... what do I have on about him so I can remember? I gave him a 1 in domestic policy and a 2 in foreign policy. So I generally, if I remember correctly, he didn't do so well, and that's why the Whigs ended up winning the next election with William Henry Harrison, who gets a 2 and a 2. He didn't achieve much while in office. He also didn't ruin anything. And the reason he didn't achieve much was because he died very quickly once in office, and was soon succeeded by John Tyler. John Tyler was another Whig president, although generally it was said that his sympathies were with the Democrats, and because of that, he was criticized by both sides, and ultimately the vast majority of his cabinet had resigned. So in domestic policy, he didn't fare very well, but in foreign policy, he did have a few achievements. So I gave him a middle rating of a 4 and a C rating. Well, 4 for a total. Foreign policy was a 3. So anyway, next president, James K. Polk. James K. Polk in the AA category. You may wonder, what did James K. Polk do to get into the AA category? Well, he overall had a very strong domestic policy, and also ended up gaining what I think is more land than any other president, which on a strategic side of things gives him a 4, which ultimately puts him at a total rating of a 7. It is worth noting that his position was somewhere in between the Democrats and the Whigs when it concerned many issues, which meant that he was relatively unpopular. However, he did famously keep a lot of his campaign promises, which can't be said for a lot of presidents. So that really puts him in a high category. Next president, we've got another Whig. James K. Polk chose not to run for a second term, so he was instead replaced by Zachary Taylor, who had been a general in the Mexican War, the Mexican-American War, which was the war that James K. Polk had fought against Mexico, and therefore had acquired the regions of California and New Mexico, as well as achieving the full annexation of Texas, and settling the final issue when it concerns Oregon country. I'm sorry, I'm going back on James K. Polk. Although the vast majority of it had been settled previous to his presidency. So we can't give him credit for all of Oregon country, but he did settle the final agreement on that. Anyway, Zachary Taylor, middle of the line, not much to be said about him. He also died in office. Very common thing among the Whigs, which led to the next president, Millard Fillmore, who did poorly on domestic policy. However, he did have some achievements in foreign policy, so he gets also a middle of a line C rating. It is worth noting that all four of the Whig presidents gain a C rating, and only half of them were actually elected. The other half only got in because their previous president died. Anyway, the next president, Franklin Pierce, gets a double F rating. Why? Because Franklin Pierce ultimately had some problems when it concerns domestic policy as well as foreign policy, which his domestic policy having to do with the fact of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which occurred during his presidency, which ultimately led to a sort of a pre-Civil War in Kansas, where the Free Soilers and the pro-slavery individuals were having disputes as to which side the state would join upon becoming a full member of a union, and this was because it was put up to a vote, and unfortunately, both sides sought to achieve the majority and to intimidate the other side, which led to a lot of violence in Kansas. So ultimately, he didn't do very well. The next one, James Buchanan, also at zero on domestic policy. He didn't do too well, and it is worth noting that very frequently he takes the blame for the eventual secession of the southern states. Although I would say his foreign policy was not in any way excessively bad or excessively good, so he gets a 2 from me. Abraham Lincoln, in the A rating, Abraham Lincoln on domestic policy, he gets a 2, although he did indeed end up freeing the slaves. Although, if I remember correctly, his original position was that of free soil. He wasn't a full abolitionist. However, eventually in the war, that's the position he ended up taking. And but that would be a plus in some sense, because however, in a negative sense, the economy did indeed tank when a large portion of the country seceded, and he did end up having to print paper money, which at the time wasn't considered to be very good, and he also ended up having to levy income taxes. And although those things eventually went away in some sense, They ended up leading to certain monetary policies down the line that weren't too good. So economically and domestically, I'm sorry, I give him a middle of a line, a 2. But when it concerns strategic policy and foreign policy, he gets a 4. I would say a big bonus as to why he gets a 4 on these policies is because he kept a large part of the country from leaving the country, which is very important strategically. And he also had some foreign policy achievements as well. However, mostly the Civil War is where we're on when it concerns strategic policy. The next one is Andrew Johnson, 1 in domestic, 3 in foreign. Gets a middle of the line rating. Generally speaking, Andrew Johnson is considered to be a bit like John Tyler in that he became president because his president died, and also he was a bit of a compromise candidate to help unite the country because he originally ran on the, I think it's called National Union, was a political party, which was a political party which ran during the American Civil War in the North, mostly organized by Republicans, but there were also Democrats in it as well. And he was a bit of the compromise candidate for the Democrats because his policy was more in line with that of the Northern Democrats at the time. However, ultimately, he did not achieve too well economically. However, when it concerns foreign policy, he did achieve the annexation of Alaska, which, although at the time was not considered to be very good, in the long term, it seems to have been strategically useful. Next president, Ulysses S. Grant, gets a 5. 3 in foreign policy, 2 in domestic. 3 in domestic policy, 3 in foreign policy. 3 in domestic policy, 2 in foreign policy. Generally noted for initiating what would eventually become a long line of presidents that were interested in civil service reform. Although he is noted for having exercised quite a bit of spoils system nepotism, it is worth noting that ultimately speaking, I would say that his domestic policy ended up being successful despite his nepotistic tendencies. Next president, Rutherford B. Hayes, also a civil service reform president. But ultimately, these presidents in what would eventually be called the Gilded Era and the Reconstruction Era, after the Civil War and before the turn of before World War I, they are largely forgotten by a lot of people because there weren't many major events that took place, and they also somewhat look similar in the fact that they all started wearing beards after Abraham Lincoln. But that's another story. Anyway, next one, James A. Garfield. He died in office. However, ultimately, I would say he was a bit middle of the line on everything, so 2.24 rating. Next president. The next president. Okay, I'm just scrolling this down so everyone can see the bottom half of everything. Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland has a 2 and a 3, which gives him a 5. His foreign policy, not so much as his strategic policy. He initiated several military reforms and built several fortresses on the coast, which ultimately served the strategic interest of the United States. It is also worth noting he served 2 non-consecutive terms, but he's only on here once. Why? Because I disagree with the general trend of considering him to be 2 different presidencies. because on that same note, I would consider consecutive terms to be different administrations, but that's just me. But anyway, he was president twice, but is one person, so he's on here once. It is also worth noting that he had some controversies regarding his personal life, and also the fact that he secretly at some point had cancer while running for office, which, generally speaking, is not a good thing to do, because president should, in some sense, be in good health. But anyway, not going to get into the mama, where's my pa, gone to the White House, ha ha ha. That's all I got to say, and you can look it up yourself. Anyway, next president is Benjamin Harrison, who was in between the two terms of Grover Cleveland. Benjamin Harrison, I would say he did not do as well on domestic policy as Grover Cleveland. And the reason I say that is, if I remember correctly, what I didn't like about him is that he was the one that started the antitrust things, which I strongly oppose. I am a pro-trust individual in the economic sense of things, just if anybody's wondering. The next one, I'm not an ANCAP, if anybody's wondering that. William McKinley, 2, 4, and a 6. So domestic policy, pretty usual for many of the Republicans of his time. However, his foreign policy ended up achieving the Spanish-American War, in which he took over quite a bit of territory in the Caribbean, as well as some in the Pacific. And ultimately, really, it was during this time that the U.S. started projecting power on a global scale, although it already had begun happening, especially when it concerns the Americas and the Pacific during the Reconstruction era. But his achievement in the Spanish-American War is noteworthy. But he also got assassinated as well. He died in office, and therefore was replaced by the next person on the list, Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, from me, he gets a 0 in domestic policy and a 3 in foreign policy. I really don't like the progressive policies, to be honest. I think that they're very bad, and ultimately, economically, are partially at fault for many of the economic troubles that the United States is in now, as well as some social issues as well. However, he was strong on the foreign policy, so I did give him some credit where credit is due. Next president, William Howard Taft, just generally a bit better on domestic policy, not as good as on foreign policy, so also gets a D rating. The next president after that is Woodrow Wilson, who is the second Democratic president since the Civil War, after, of course, Grover Cleveland. Now, Woodrow Wilson is the first one on the list here to get a triple F rating. You may wonder, why does Woodrow Wilson get a triple F rating? Well, ultimately on domestic policy, he ended up putting in a lot of progressive reforms, in addition to ultimately fostering what many would consider to be a sort of a type of racism that ultimately undid much of the progress that had been done when it concerns racial equality. So on a domestic policy side, not too good. He also chose to remain in office while being extremely ill, to the point of not being able to fully sign his bills on his own, which is also very problematic. Foreign policy-wise, while some might say that he did put the United States in a more prominent position when it concerns foreign policy, he ultimately, the 14 points ended up not achieving a lot, ultimately leading to World War II in his foreign policy. So while I'm not saying that World War II is his fault, what I'm saying is that his foreign policy, while being highly idealistic, did not have a lot of foresight, so he gets a 0. And ultimately, he also can be criticized for his actions during World War I, but that's not really something I'm going to get into now. But anyway, the next president after that is none other than President Harding himself. The man, myth, the legend, Warren G. Harding, ultimately gets a 1 and a 1, both foreign and domestic, for a lot of controversies that he got into, and also for the Washington Naval Treaty. Disarmament is not really strategically advantageous, so that also gets some demerits on foreign policy. But he was soon succeeded by none other than John Calvin Coolidge, or more commonly known as Calvin Coolidge, who, in my opinion, had some of the best domestic policy, especially when it concerns economic policy. I'm pretty sure Reagan agrees on that. Well, actually, I know for a fact he agrees on that. But he also, not too many foreign policy achievements, so middle on the line on that. So he gets a 2, 4, 6, putting him strongly in the A category, and really being the only 4 on domestic policy, besides George Washington, that I have on my list as far as I can tell. Next one. The next president after that is, of course, Herbert Hoover. Gets a 2 on domestic policy, a 2 on foreign policy, a 0 on domestic policy. Really dropped the ball there with his policies. And he's very frequently blamed for the Great Depression. But you know who else can be blamed for the Great Depression to some extent? His successor, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, commonly known as FDR. He ultimately had a lot of economic policies that led to the United States being in the Great Depression a lot longer than other countries. Had a lot slower recovery, and his foreign policy can also be considered to have not been the best, and he's not in this category because of his polio, of his crippling polio. That's not why he's in this category, but he is in it because he gets a 0, a 1, and a 1. So a double F rating. Next president, we have Harry S. Truman. Harry Truman, domestic policy, I would say, was better than FDR in some respects. However, I still ended up giving him a 1 because it had a lot of similar aspects, so I didn't like it. But his foreign policy, Harry Truman ended up founding NATO, and although he didn't go forward with escalating the Korean War as MacArthur had suggested, he did strongly strengthen the United States' strategic interests worldwide. So he gets a 4 on foreign policy, so it's a 145 for Harry S. Truman. And after him, we of course get to Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower, of course, I also didn't like his domestic policy, and he did however have some foreign policy achievements, so I give him that, which gives him a total rating of a 4. Then after him, we have JFK, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. I don't like his foreign policy, and I don't like his domestic policy, but they're not the worst. So I give him a 1, a 1, and a 2 F rating. I would have to say that I'm not going to give him bonus points for being assassinated. I don't give bonus points for that. So there you go. He was, of course, succeeded by someone that I consider to have even worse taste in policy, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who ultimately ended up really dropping the ball when it concerns domestic policy with a great society, and also when it concerns foreign policy, not too good as well. And this is the time that the Vietnam War was really starting to rage here. And he was succeeded by Nixon, of course, everybody's favorite, or perhaps least favorite in many cases, Richard Nixon. Domestic policy, business as usual, really. Foreign policy, he did have some achievements in foreign policy, and that's really how that ties in. Now, concerning the controversy over the spying, although he himself was not the one that was instigating it, he did indeed find out about the wiretapping and didn't do anything about it. He didn't say anything. And because he didn't blow his own whistle, somebody else blew his whistle, and that's always an embarrassing moment. So, however, that's not really a foreign policy or domestic policy failure. So the Watergate controversy doesn't really factor in at all. And some people will say it should factor in, but I made the categories, so if it doesn't fit the categories, that's just how the cookie crumbles. He was succeeded by Gerald R. Ford, and well, is it an R? I forget. Gerald Ford. Let's just say Ford. 224, pretty average, not much going on. But then you've got Jimmy Carter. Everybody's they call him the Peanut, although I think that's maybe not the most charitable term. On domestic policy, there were some big economic problems during his presidency. Foreign policy was fine, so he gets a D rating. And he was followed by Ronald Reagan, although he didn't have the best economic and domestic policy. I think his policies certainly were an improvement. And although he didn't make the biggest achievements in foreign policy, I think he also made certainly some achievements. So he gets just an above average in everything, 336. So there you go. He was, of course, followed by George H.W. Bush. George H.W. Bush is notable for not doing too well domestically. However, I would have to say that in foreign policy, he did make some gains. So he averages out on a 4. And he was, of course, followed by none other than the man, the myth, the legend. Well, maybe. I did not have any legendary relations with this individual. Bill Clinton, who gets a rating of a 5. Why does he get a 5? Because of the fact that his domestic policy was fine. He gets a pass on domestic policy. He gets a 2. Foreign policy, he even gets a 3. He made some gains in foreign policy, so he gets a total of a 5. Now, you may wonder, why am I not... And again, when people are asking about, what about the Monica Lewinsky and the lying in front of the country, and what about the allegations about Chinese donors and selling secrets and things like that? That doesn't factor in. So it's not a category, so it doesn't factor in. So he gets a 5. So there you go. Next president, it's George W. Bush on the double F rating. Ooh, how did he get a double F rating, you may wonder. Well, ultimately, on domestic policy, uh, this is in recent memory, so maybe it's a bit harsher when in recent memory. But his policies did end up leading to a huge economic downturn, the biggest since the Great Depression. We call it the Great Recession. Some people say it was even bigger, but I don't know. I've never lived through the Great Depression. But anyway, so he gets a 0 on domestic policy and a 1 on foreign policy, because ultimately his wars didn't really pan out and ultimately caused more damage than they fixed. So we end up going even further downhill with Barack Obama. Barack Hussein Obama. I remember when that came out on TV, the kids doing that. But anyway, Barack Obama followed in somewhat similar policies to George W. Bush when it concerns economic bailouts. And it's got to be said, I don't think that shoving government money into the economy is really in any way a long-term solution, but that seems to be the main orthodoxy nowadays. But anyway, shoved a ton of money into the economy, didn't really help very much, but things eventually started turning back up. Although he did deport more individuals than his predecessor, there was also an increase in the prominence of the issue of illegal immigration. Then there's the Affordable Care Act, which I have personally, having worked in taxes, I've personally witnessed how much of a pain this is to just every single person. And so ultimately, domestic policy gets a 0. There's many other things I could talk about, but now we get to foreign policy, and it is indeed the Obama administration, along with Hillary Clinton, who was the Secretary of State, that really ended up pushing into and supporting the Arab Spring, which ultimately led to thousands upon thousands of people dying, and the U.S. not making very many foreign policy gains, Russia growing in a global status, and a real beginning of a rivalry and an inflammation when it concerns North Korea, and ultimately just the beginning of what began to be a collapse in the confidence that the international community has in the dollar. Because the way it works right now is that oil, or petroleum, I should say, is traded in US dollars. And it is during the Obama administration when other countries like China and Russia began considering that maybe the US dollar isn't as strong as it has been considered. So there you go. And also from the Bush administration, you've got the housing bubble, which I spoke to a lawyer who claims to have some insider information on this, who says that the housing bubble was engineered. Thanks, Bush. Thanks, Obama. But anyway, going back onto Obama. So ultimately, his foreign policy ended up, in my opinion, severely weakening the position of the United States abroad, as well as its strategic power, and also failing in the strategic endeavors that the United States really went out to do. And also on a domestic front, the just having policies that didn't really help the Great Recession as much as they could have, and as well as the Affordable Care Act, which has really hamstrung a lot of individuals who are now have to pay many hundreds of dollars for something that they normally wouldn't pay for. But anyway, there you go. And you may think Donald Trump. Well, Donald Trump is still the president at the time that I'm making this video, so he doesn't really appear on the list so far. However, you may see that I do have room. I could put him anywhere on the list. So I'll tell you where I have put him for now. In fact, I'll show you where I have put him for now. So let me just open up another one of these, and I can switch over to another one. There we go. So this is Donald Trump. So Donald Trump, now let me just say I'm not a Trump supporter. I didn't vote for Trump, but I do have to say that economically it's definitely an improvement over what was happening during the Obama administration. Although I'm not behind his repeal and replace, I'm more of a full repeal when it concerns the Affordable Care Act. However, while he has had some achievements, they aren't the greatest achievements. It still has yet to be seen whether the United States can have a full achievement when it concerns domestic policy, and also when it concerns foreign policy. It's been a bit of a mixed bag. I'm not really approving of his attack and interference during the Syrian civil war. It seems to be a bit of a continuation of Obama's policies on that. And also just the whole statement, we're going to make Mexico pay for the wall, from the very beginning. It's just an unrealistic statement. I can't imagine anyone who actually took that to be serious. Although I can't imagine how anyone could, but it's funny that there are actually people that took that statement seriously. And now, well, who's laughing now? Mexico's not paying for the wall. They're not going to pay for it. But anyway, so again, mixed bag. However, certainly better than Obama, certainly better than Bush, better than JFK, perhaps even better than good old Jimmy Carter. So there you go, just middle of the line. However, I am open to the possibility that Donald Trump will make a major foreign policy achievement, or a major economic or some other domestic policy achievement, some major civil service reform, perhaps. Get back to the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, get some civil service reform done. That would be great stuff. But so far, just seeing more of the same with his use of executive orders, as opposed to really supporting legislation as much as constitutionally he should. But anyway, there you go. Middle of the line on Donald Trump. Could do better. You know, don't see this, Trump supporters out there, don't see this as me discrediting him. I'm giving him a lot of credit, okay? I'm saying he's a lot better than Obama. I'm just saying that there's room to grow. But there's also room to fall, you know? You never know. Maybe there's a big faux pas down the line, a big mess up. But there you go. Thank you all for watching. Tell me what you think. Do you think that this is an accurate list? Do you think it's inaccurate? Tell me which president you think should be somewhere else on the list. Maybe you can make your own list, maybe on the same criteria that I do with my 4 and 8 point system, and therefore put various individuals in different places. Maybe you're more on the progressive side when it concerns things, maybe on the side of more Keynesian or orthodox economics. I'm more of the Austrian school type myself. So, you know, there you go. So thank you all for watching, and I will be seeing you all next time on Awiltos. Over and out.